Our next up is Kim Mireles. Kim Mireles works for Luminant, and she's going to talk to us about coal combustible residuals and the regulations that are out there now. And so I'm going to turn it over to Kim.
First big hurdle was making sure I didn't fall down when I got here. Thank you. I'm privileged to join you today. I will have to say, Alan called me about less than 2 weeks ago and said, "Hey, Kim, can you do this for me?" The reason Alan did that is because Alan and I know each other. I know several of the folks in here and from the groundwater districts. When the CCR rule first came out, and there's been a lot of published reports about it and a lot of concern, they asked us to come talk to their areas, the ones that we are familiar with. They asked us to come to each one of their board meetings. I said, I can't do that, but I can come if you'll all get together in one place. I can come and explain kind of what the thing is. So that's why he picked me, because I had explained this before. And so I have a tremendous amount of slides here that I promise you I won't go through every one of them. So the CCR rule was published April 17th and came into the Federal Register on October 19th. It regulates CCR as non-hazardous waste. It's in the RCRA rules, which is 257 Subtitle D of the non-hazardous waste rules. It affects new and existing CCR landfills and impoundments. That's both new and existing both. That does include any lateral expansion or of any existing unit. So what is CCR? CCR is coal combustion residuals, meaning bottom ash, fly ash, we call it FGD, that's scrubber areas. So we have impoundments and landfills. Landfills are where you store dry material, and the impoundments typically are not stored in there, but you sluice, meaning the fines from the bottom ash, you transport it through there. So a lot of these things, even though they're very large, they don't necessarily contain a whole amount of solids. They typically have a little bit of a residual and a lot of water, and you're constantly recycling. We do try to be good stewards of the water and recycle in our process instead of discharging that. So this, again, the rule, this is a different rule. It's self-implementing, which means EPA didn't have authority over it, TCEQ didn't have authority over it. It's all based on your industry members putting their information out on public websites, and the enforcement piece of it is through citizen suits. So this is a very different rule. I'm not accustomed to many more rules like this one. And the states have their own solid waste management plan. So there's a process where right now it's a federal rule. States could adopt it. They're not required to. So again, the rule establishes minimal national criteria. There's quite a few of them in there. Again, I'm going to try to go. I talk very fast, but again, the material's up here. I don't want to cover everything on the PowerPoints, and there could be a mistake. I finished this at 10 o'clock last night, so if it is, I apologize. So the high-level requirements are for these landfills and for the impoundments. You have location restrictions, which is siting and where they're located. Where are they in the depth to groundwater? It's quite a few of those. There are design standards. What are the liners like? And remember, many of these have been around for years and years and years, 40, 50 years. But we had to come back and find all the information of how they were structured, built, constructed. Structural integrity, obviously that's a big deal. Safety factors, those type of things. Operating criteria. And I'm going to go into a little bit of each one of these as we move along. Groundwater monitoring and corrective action, which again I know you're most interested in. Closure and post-closure care. How do we close these, cap them? What do we do with the material? The post-closure care, again, there's a lot of groundwater monitoring that we've been doing, and we were doing this well before this rule came along as far as monitoring and providing that information to our state. Record-keeping notification, public internet posting requirements. Again, if you ever want to go out there and look, EPA has their website. You can find a list of every single CCR, basically any industry members that have coal combustion residuals, and they'll have a website, and you can go out there and find that information. I should have put the link on here. Apologies, I didn't do that. And then beneficial use. So a lot of this material, the bottom ash, fly ash, gypsum stuff, we use these a lot in making products. So where we don't have to store it and dispose of it, we're trying to sell it and make sure that it can be used in like roads and wallboard, basically any way that we can use the cement. Cement is probably the primary use for these products. Again, not going to go through this, but I think what I want to convey to you is we have a tremendous amount of requirements. Each one of these things that I've talked about, the location restrictions, you look at that, there's placement above the aquifer, wetlands, fault areas, seismic impact zones. We have to deal with endangered species, whatever the floodplains are. Again, just a tremendous amount of requirements. And you can see if you have an existing CCR landfill or you're going to build new, you have different requirements. So where it's grayed out, those don't necessarily have the same requirements, and that's because the landfills that are handled dry don't have near as much of requirements as what the impoundments do, and that's because it has to do with water. Again, so if you look, the difference between these is landfills versus impoundments. So again, impoundments have a lot more criteria. Again, I'm not intending for you to see every bit of this, but you will have this presentation, so if you want to look at it, you're welcome to do that. Again, drilling down a little bit on the location restrictions. Again, their placement above the aquifer, wetlands, fault areas, seismic impact zones, unstable areas, and these units are prohibited from being sited in these areas unless they can meet those specific demonstrations. The demonstrations have to be PE certified. So many of us from an industry perspective, we don't do this on our own. Although we know our business and we know it well, we depend on the experts in this area. So we have to use professional engineers to help us with a lot of this on the demonstrations. Liner design. So new landfills and impoundments, the rule requires that you use composite liners. Again, it's like a 30 mil geomembrane. Again, won't go through all the technical pieces of this, but there are a lot of very specific requirements about what the liners have to be. And then the rule will tell you, based on how that impoundment or that landfill is lined, of whether you can continue to use that, or in the future you'll have to close it. So again, they're existing landfills and impoundments. We've got new landfills that have to have composite liners. Existing landfills and impoundments, they have to have the same as above, but they also allowed us to use I'll just call it a very clay-lined liner. And you'll see in the forward slides, there has been so many changes to this rule. We really struggle to try and keep up with what's the flavor of the day. The structural integrity, obviously, that came along from when this rule really took play, which was there were two very large impoundments, TVA in Kingston, and also Duke had one that basically it breached, and so this is a result of a lot of those rules. Again, there's other design criteria. Operational criteria. So we have to do fugitive dust control plans. We have to have run-on and run-off controls, what's coming in, what's going out. Hydrologic and hydraulic capacity requirements for the surface impoundments, and then weekly inspections. Every week we're having to make weekly inspections and log what we find and keep track of that. Record keeping and notification. All owners and operators have to record the compliance with the requirements in what we call our facilities operating record. So we have two areas that we keep information. One is on-site and our facility operating record, and the other is on the public website. The rule is very specific. It tells you exactly what you have to do in your operating record and what you have to put in on the public website. And it has timelines. Very, very good on deadlines. And then every time you post something to the public website, you are also sending at the same time a notification to the state. So that email will go to the state and it'll say, hey, we just put something out there and here's what it is. Now, I don't send them. I don't think they could take all the information that we're having to provide out there. There, as I talked about a while ago too, there are closure and post-closure care. So when I say closure and post-closure, how do you cap that landfill when you're finished? And there are, when you move through this process, you may have a very large area. You're placing in one area. When you finish there, you cap that and you move over to your next area. So there are requirements in this rule about how you close it, what specifications that you use, and then the post-closure care is all the groundwater monitoring that will continue for decades, like 30 years. What triggers forced closure of a CCR unit? And this is some of the big things that have come up in this rule. Failure to meet the location restrictions. You have a certain amount of time, and you'll see this here shortly, you have a certain amount of time to demonstrate whether you met the location restrictions or not, where it's located. Unlined impoundments where groundwater results are in excess of the groundwater protection standards. These are all reasons for forced closure. Forced closure of that particular impoundment. The impoundment cannot meet, if it can't meet the minimum factor of safety regarding the structural integrity, it's having to close. And when I say it has to close, if you can imagine if you're operating a power plant and you have this in your operation, you can't just blink your eyes and close that. There is a process, procedure that you have to go through, and that in order for that power plant to continue operating, and as you can see probably from the last couple of weeks, if you've read in the news, Texas has been very stressed on power. We have to have a plan and a mechanism to do that in order to continue operating. Other reasons for closure would be if the CCR unit receives known final waste. So in other words, if you know you're not going to place any more waste in that, maybe you're moving on to your next cell, it has a defined period for when you have to close that and how you do it. If it is, let's say you're planning to put more material in it, but it's been idle for 2 years, that's also going to be a trigger for forced closure. And again, I said the post-closure care is 30 years. You have to maintain the final cover system. You have to have a leachate collection and removal system, groundwater monitoring system, those kind of things. So we talked a little bit about beneficial use. Beneficial use, again, is what you can make of that product instead of disposing it or processing it. It has to meet criteria in this rule. So that rule says it's got to have a functional benefit. It has to substitute for a virgin material, conserving natural resources. It must meet relevant product specs, must meet regulatory standards and design standards. When it is unencapsulated and you are preparing to have it sold, there's requirements around that also. And right now, this is one that's up for change in some of the rules. Okay, so next is alternative closure requirements. Now, I talked a little bit about you can't just blink your eyes and close these things. We obviously, if you don't have another place to put this material and it has to close, the EPA has given us some alternative closure options. They still have requirements. They still have deadlines that we have to meet. But if the surface impoundment is greater than 40 acres, you have to cease operation and complete closure by October 17th, 2023. But before you could get that alternative closure, there's a ton of demonstrations that you have to make. And every year you have to provide a report that says either I'm trying to tell you how I'm finding additional capacity, and I have to give you an update and a report on how that's going. So it's not an open-end ticket. You have to demonstrate how your need is for this before you're allowed. If it is greater than 40 acres, then you have up until October of 2028 to, okay, so let me stop right there. I'm kind of mixing things. If you're going to continue operating, you have to make that demonstration. You have up to 5 single year that you can extend that. The second piece of that alternative closure is you have to say, I'm going to close my power plant. So these are the 2 areas that you can do this. That second one says, I'm going to close my power plant. That's where the 40 acre or smaller, where you get until, and that is, you have to have them closed, not cease placing. They have to be completely closed by October of 2023. That may sound like a long time, but these are not tiny things, and it takes a while to get. Think about in Texas. There's a short period of time when the sun is shining and it's great weather to do closures, and then there's that time where it's raining like crazy, and the fastest you're trying to get that water out of there, it's raining again. So it does take time to do all of this. What was that last one? Yeah, the CCR landfill, so again, difference between impoundments and landfills, and that's because you're trying to deal with the water. And if we're going to deal with water, it has to meet the standards. Today, we have standards. There's another rule that's not the CCR rule. It's called the effluent limitation guidelines. It's going to establish much stricter criteria. So again, we've got to deal with a multitude of these rules, and we're weaving our way through that. But a landfill, even if you did ask for alternative closure, it has to be closed no later than April 19th of 2021. And remember, I'm not asking for approval from EPA. I'm not asking approval for TCQ. We have to prove our position because this is a self-implementing rule. There's nobody that's really looking over our shoulders right now. EPA does have, and I'll talk about that in a minute, some enforcement authority now, but they didn't initially when this rule came. And they created it this way. They created it so that it would be a citizen suit rule. That's how they wanted it enforced. Groundwater monitoring. This is where I think you'll be most interested. So there are 3 phases of groundwater monitoring that we have to perform: detection monitoring, assessment monitoring, and corrective measures. In detection monitoring, at the very beginning of this, we had to set up a network of wells. We had to set up a minimum of 1 up gradient and 3 down gradient wells and establish a background. In other words, if groundwater's flowing this way, I have an up gradient and I have a down gradient. So if it's up here, more than likely, this unit didn't cause that contamination. It's coming from somewhere else. And again, but that's not just a simple, you can't just say that. There's proof, there's all kinds of things that we have to do to go through to prove this. And much of it is about our groundwater samples and through this process. We must choose a statistical procedure to compare the background to the up gradient concentrations. And then we have to monitor semi-annually for Appendix 3, and those parameters are shown down there at the bottom. So it's boron, calcium, chloride, fluoride, pH, sulfate, and TDS. Those are the things that you monitor under detection monitoring. And remember, your monitoring at this level will go through phases. So if you detect something in these constituents that are above an established groundwater protection standard, you'll move into the next phase. Again, you monitor semi-annually. That SSI is a statistically significant increase. Don't try to say that 3 times fast. And you can demonstrate, as I said earlier, if you have some samples that show that you have detected some of these parameters, you can also look to see, is there a potential alternate source demonstration? If there is, you have to prove that, and you have to put that out there on the website too. If you did detect a statistically significant increase, I'm going to call it SSI, then you move into the next monitoring phase, which is called assessment monitoring. So if that's triggered, you sample annually at first for all of the Appendix 4. Those are the constituents down there. And then after that, you monitor semi-annually if any of those constituents shown up as detection in that category. If any Appendix 4 constituents are detected at a statistically significant level, different than an SSI, then you have to characterize the nature and the extent of the release. You have to install additional monitoring wells. You have to initiate an assessment of corrective measures. And again, you also have another opportunity to say, is this, through all of your process and your statistical and your modeling and all this, is there another source that this could be coming from? And again, all of that has to be justified. Many of these things have to be PE certified. It can't be just us saying it. It has to be by consultants that we use who are experts in this area. What is an assessment of corrective measures? Okay, so when you go through, if you've triggered that SSL, statistically significant level, you have to go through this analysis, and you have to look at all the options of what is it that I could do for corrective measures. And we have to discuss all these options. We have to have, again, a certified PE go through. We don't come up with these, they do. They go through and evaluate what are the options that we could do with cleaning up this groundwater. We have to discuss that in a public meeting. So for anyone that's gotten to this level, you'll have to go through and conduct a public meeting, and you'll go through what that assessment was. What did that consultant show as options? In those options, it'll tell you how long it'll take you to clean up the groundwater and what criteria that's used to consider that. Let's see, what else? So the remedies, what do they have to be? They have to be protective of human health and the environment. They have to attain the groundwater protection standard for 3 consecutive years and control the source of the release. They have to control the source of the release and remove from the environment as much of the contaminated material that was released from the CCR unit as is feasible. And then we have to specify a schedule that when that will happen and when that will occur. And again, those are all the parameters that you're usually monitoring. So let's first see where I'm at.
You're good.
Okay, so what have we done so far? 2017, a lot of the things that I've talked about, and I'm not going to read these for you. I've got other stuff I want to talk about. So we've been busy. There's just a lot that has happened. And it sounds like even what I have on here on words, there's a lot of work that has to be done. And for us, I am from Luminant. We have a lot of sites. We've recently closed 3 of our coal power plants, and regardless of what people might say, we still have a lot of requirements. It is our responsibility to make sure that we take care of that site, and we will. We have another couple of sites that are also coal sites. So we are in this process, and it's why I have to know so much about it, because it's kind of what I do. Rule changes and litigation. As I said earlier, this rule has been changing since day one. I cannot even begin to tell you how many things have gone on about this. So there's been litigation. Again, I'm not going to walk through each one of these, but there are some important things in here. So I've kept talking about the fact that this rule is self-implementing. The WIN Act was passed through the legislation. Congress allowed consideration that there needs to be a regulatory authority. Self-implementing might sound good, but you need to have some authority one way or the other. So this says you can now have states take on these programs. That's what the WIN Act was about, but EPA hasn't put that in their rules yet. They actually tried, they passed some legislation to do that. They're allowed to do it, but it's not in the CCR rule yet. They tried to do that, but again, that was challenged. So we're in this back and forth zone of what's going to happen. The states would like to. Some of them would like to take on the rules. Not every state's going to. If they don't, then EPA is going to have a permitting program. But there will be an authority one way or the other as soon as they get that completed. EPA has not yet developed that permit rule program from a federal perspective. And again, if you are, whether you're industry or whether you need somebody, I think, this is my opinion, so take that for what it's worth. You need your state, what your state brings to it is we've had these units registered with the state forever. This is not new to them. EPA, even though they developed these rules, they're not as close to this as the states are. Again, most everything that we do, if it's groundwater, I'm already reporting groundwater to the state. We've been doing that for years. Some of these constituents, we weren't. So some of these constituents that are coming up are new to us. We haven't necessarily, and they're very, very low levels. So we're going through that process. But again, note that anything that is happening through this process of what I've explained, it goes out on the public website. TCQ gets a copy of it, and we're in there because we also have to comply with the state rules. Carrie mentioned TERP. TERP is the Texas Risk Reduction Program. Through that program with the state, you have effective property assessment reports. You have to go through that. If you trigger a constituent of concern above a certain protective concentration level, we have to go in and talk with the state about that, and we go through a process. You'll go through drinking water surveys. We'll look for the areas around and provide anything that's within a half mile. They have a record of those drinking water wells. We have the reason that we have to go and get that information and provide it to them, but they also have that information. And so then they'll come back and tell us if there is an issue, and then they'll contact a site, an appropriate property owner if they believe that there's impact. So again, that's ongoing also. Again, you can read these. There's just a tremendous amount of change in the rules. One of the big things that's up for discussion is the date of closure. When will we actually, if you have a problem with one of these, when is it that you actually are going to have to close? That date is shifting around. EPA is supposed to come out with at least 2 more rules, and they're preparing to do that. They'll go through public comment period. So, look for those things if you'd like to comment. Again, more rule changes in litigation. In August, the DC, so this is a big one. One of the primary set of litigation was the utility group that led some litigation against EPA. The court came out very recently, back on in August of 2018, and listed several areas where they disagreed with EPA, and they remanded some of these things back to EPA again. So, again, more rule changes are coming. Again, they denied a lot of the NGO things, they denied a lot of the industry complaints, and then they came out and said that clay lined, which was by the rule allowed, clay line impoundments were supposed to be considered lined. And let me say, when you hear that an impoundment is unlined, that's because of a definition. That's not necessarily because it's not lined. There's criteria. It's a demonstration of what they deem as lined. So now, again, these impoundments that were built 40, 50 years ago, maybe, some of them, others maybe newer, they were considered lined back then. That was the standard. Now they're saying they're unlined. So you're in the middle of running these power plants, and if you have 3 impoundments and they say those are all unlined, guess what? It is forcing these plants to consider economically whether they can continue to operate. And even if they don't operate, you still have to meet a tremendous amount of requirements. There will be timelines associated with all of these. Again, state participation. Right now, I have a correction that I need to make. It says 3 states have submitted. Only 2 states have submitted plans to be approved by EPA. The third one is Alabama. They have written rules and finalized them for their state, but they have not submitted their plan, so that's a correction. They haven't submitted yet. They have finalized their own plans for their state. I'm sure they'll probably submit those plans to EPA once things get settled down a little bit. I mean, right now it's a moving target. States don't necessarily want to jump in and try to do this because they don't know, what do I put in my rules? It's a big resource challenge for the states to go in and write rules and get everything situated to do that. They don't want to do it 4 times. I think that's all. Any questions? And I'm sure you might have many. And I'm sorry I talk very fast.
Any questions for Kim?
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. No, they have not. Boy, I hope so. We are working with them. They really put it, if you do stay up with TCQ, they put a proposal together about a year ago, and they stopped it because of all the changes in the rules and said, okay, it doesn't make sense to go forward. I think they will. I'm hoping soon, actually. And there's a difference of whether, again, the other thing you have to understand is Texas has had a program for a long time. They have to change now. If they're going to adopt this rule, they have to change. That's a tremendous amount of rulemaking for them. That's a program shift. That's resources and change. So they're going to do it, but I would suggest that they possibly would consider adopting the rule by reference, just taking it as is, and then trying to figure out how they manage it within their program later. Yeah, I hate that. I'm going to say it's not us. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kim.